Hey, and it's your girl Mel, and I have your word of the day. Today's topic is, are you losing your mind? What you eat affects how your mind functions. What you take in affects your capacity to think. Many people, because of the way they eat, have unbalanced minds. And a man or woman with an unbalanced mind makes unbalanced decisions. It is by the practice of destructive habits, of the indulgence of what the world has to offer, that men and women destroy their minds. Drugs and alcohol, stimulants, sugar, caffeine, and the carcass of diseased animals. We are using slow and sure poisons. See, the brain is the capital of the body, the crown, the jewel, the seat of intelligence, the interpreter of the senses, the initiator of body movement, and the controller of behavior. Every organ of the body is the servant of the brain. The nerves proceeding from the brain control the body. Whatever disturbs the circulation of the electric currents in the nervous system lessens the strength and your reasoning power. Any part of the body that is injured communicates it to the brain. Anything that hinders the active motion of the body affects the brain directly. And so we see the connection between physical and mental. Intellectual power, the physical stamina, the length of life depend on the health of the mind. But here's a problem. We have allowed appetite and passion to rule us than reason and intellect. See, the battle between good and evil is the battle for your mind. The five senses are the avenues, the gateway to your brain, to the mind. It is those that Satan comes with temptations to entice us, sin made attractive to destroy us. He shapes these temptations to impair our minds. He entices and hurries us on a downward course until his victims lose their conscience and ability to reason. And if the mind is blinded and cluttered, then we are not able to discern holy and eternal things or accept them easily. You see, the brain is the one that heaven communicates with, the one we use to worship God. The one God uses to transform and affect our lives. You see, you cannot grow spiritually if your mental state is in bad condition, which is caused by bad physical habits. And so the question is, are you willing to lose your mind? And so today we're going to break down and focus on proving that the Bible stresses the importance of health, the relationship between physical, mental, and moral. Number one, the danger, and number two, how to overcome. And so, let's break it down. Jerusalem is besieged, is taken over by Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were amongst the children of Judah who were taken from their home. The king took them because of their wisdom and skill to train them for the Babylonian leadership. And so they went through a number of changes. Change number one, there was a change in the educational system. They went from a foundation of learning of God's moral principles to the education of the Chaldeans in the language. Change number two, their names. Daniel was given the heathen god's name. He went from Daniel to Belshazzar. And change number three, they were given the king's diet, a daily provision of the king's meat and drink. Change number one and change number two were accepted, but change number three, Daniel protested. Daniel 1 verse 8. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine he drank. Why did Daniel protest? Because Daniel understood by partaking of the king's meat and drink, he would pollute himself not only physically, but spiritually, on a physical and the spiritual level. He rejected the king's dietary recommendations. Now let's put it into perspective. The king's food is given to a captive, and the captive says to the king, "It's not good enough for me." This is royal food, the best the world could offer. But yet Daniel said, no. The best the world can offer is never good enough to separate your connection with God. Satan knows that he cannot have great power over minds whose appetites are kept under control. It is easier to tempt someone who does not control their appetite than someone who does. 1 Peter 2 verse 11. Abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. A clogged body is a clogged mind. We would save much suffering if we had self-control. The majority of diseases and suffering and mental anguish in the world come from the lack of self-control. Daniel knew this, and so to preserve his mind, he protested. Proverbs 4 verse 23. Keep your heart with all diligence, for out of it spring the issues of life. Physical habits affect and cripple the moral powers of a man or a woman. They would cripple his ability to obey God. The greatest crime is to take something God has given and use it to disgrace him. Many of us will lose a place in God's kingdom for a failure in controlling our appetites. And so Daniel and his friends requested that they go on a 10-day simple diet that consisted of vegetables and water. And after the end of the 10 days, they appeared much fairer and fatter and better in appearance than all the other children who indulged in the king's diet. Those who become slaves to eating and gluttonous indulgences sin against God. And so there are 3 questions of great importance: what you eat, how you prepare it, and when you eat. No one who believes in God should be indifferent to the health of the body and flatter themselves that it is no sin and that it won't affect their spirituality. The standard of virtue is elevated or degraded by appetite. God intends to bring his people back to the simple diet, the one that was developed, the one that was instituted in the Garden of Eden, of vegetables and fruits and nuts and grains, the diet originally given to men. Daniel 1 verse 17. As for these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. The king found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were all in his realm. And so we see that God rewards obedience. The king found them 10 times smarter, found Daniel 10 times smarter than all his magicians and astrologers. God gave him spiritual gifts to interpret visions and dreams. God strengthened their intellect. The life of Daniel is an illustration of what it looks like for one who possesses control even in unfavorable circumstances. Surrounded by temptations, by divine grace, he was able to be firm. In order to reach the highest standard of moral and intellectual power, we must be educated and observe healthy habits. Each individual must decide if their lives will be controlled by their minds or their bodies, by your mouth and your stomach, or by reason and intellect. You must decide if what the world does, if what they say is good, or what they do is more important than what you know you must do. A transgression of the physical laws is a transgression against God's law. Why? Because it affects your usefulness in this world. It affects your salvation. This is about your character, about your destiny, about your salvation, life or death. Will you gain the world to lose your soul? For your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit, and it must be cleansed and not be defiled within or without. If you ask God, he will give you divine power and the efficiency to overcome the habits that for so long have been crippling your body and your mind. If you ask God and believe and avoid and be firm like Daniel, even in the middle of temptation, the severest trials, you will say no. And so, we must have self-control. Christ is calling you. He is calling me. He wants a spiritual union with you and I, and we must get rid of anything that separates him from us. The battle between good and evil, the battle between Christ and Satan is a battle for your mind, but you must decide which side you stand on. John 10:27 says, "My sheep hear my voice, and I know them," God says. "They follow me." It's your girl Mel Mel, and I have your word of the day. For weekly videos, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Follow me on Twitter at MelMelN7 and Instagram MelMelN.